Hi folks, and welcome to Tales of History and Imagination. My name is Simone. If you are tuning in to the podcast around the time it is being published, then happy Halloween. Today's episode was originally a 3-part blog on the show's blog site. For those of you who like to read the scripts on the blog, because this one's already up, I am dropping a couple of new blogs this week and next. After listening to today's tale, please go check out my piece on the Beast of Gévaudan on the blog site, historyandimagination.com. I should also mention when I wrote the blogs, I prefaced each chapter with a literary quote. And when you do that as an afterthought, it's easy to just dump them. I wrote each chapter with the quotes in mind, and they tend to bleed through. In the first chapter, I quote Coleridge's lines from the poem The Devil's Thoughts. Over the hills and over the dale, and he went out over the plain, and backward and forward he switched his long tail, as a gentleman switches his cane. In Part 2 I quoted Edward Bulwer Lytton's Paul Clifford. It was a dark and stormy night, the rain fell in torrents, except at occasional intervals, when it was checked by a violent gust of wind which swept up the streets, for it is in London that our scene lies. Rattling along the housetops, and fiercely agitating the scanty flame of the lamps that struggled against the darkness. Through one of the obscurest quarters of London, and among the haunts little loved by the gentlemen of the police, a man evidently of the lowest orders was wending his solitary way. And finally, I quoted from Albert Camus' novel Le Peste, or The Plague in English. He knew what those jubilant crowds did not know, but could have learned from books. That the plague bacillus never dies or disappears for good. That it can lie dormant for years and years in furniture and linen chests. That it bides its time in bedrooms, cellars, trunks and bookshelves. And that perhaps a day would come when, for all the bane and all the enlightening of men, it would rouse up its rats again and send them forth to die in a happy city. Yeah, I know, a little pompous, but if I don't put them in now, certain things don't make huge sense later, so there you go. Okay, so without too much more ado, let's just jump into this one. Today's tale, Tales of History and Imagination, Season 1, Episode 3, is Spring-Heeled Jack, the Terror of London. Spring-Heeled Jack is a nightmarish character, belonging mostly to Victorian and early Edwardian folklore. In his time he was considered a ghost, a demon, and very likely an eccentric nobleman who perpetrated a horrific, far-reaching practical joke to amuse his fellow aristocrats. His first sightings originate from 1837, and his last, if you were to take it that Spring-Heeled Jack as having been a real person, and he certainly wasn't one person, was all the way out in 1904. In 1878 he was immortalised in print, getting his own penny dreadful, Spring-Heeled Jack, the Terror of London. The series of tales, written by George Augustus Sala, put the figure of Spring-Heeled Jack in an unusual position, probably not to be said of any other person mentioned in Tales of History and Imagination. Alongside Hugo Hercules of 1902, John Carter of Mars, 1911, The Grey Seal, 1914, Zorro, 1919, The Shadow, 1930, The Green Hornet and Cato, 1931, Doc Savage, 1933, Mandrake the Magician, 1935, Dr. Occult, 1935, The Clock and the Phantom, 1936. Spring-Heeled Jack has become a noted antecedent to Siegel and Schuster's Superman, even if in reality he was far more a villain than ever a hero. As a side note, if you're ever at a loose end, just Google superheroes before Superman. It is a rabbit hole you can lose days in exploring. From 1968, one might use the term urban legend to describe Spring-Heeled Jack. Thanks to Professor Jan Brunvand for inventing that term. In this day and age, Spring-Heeled Jack may be considered more a meme. Thank you, Professor Richard Dawkins, for that term. And like any meme, he would have spread far and wide via creepypastas, 4chan, and Reddit, like the Slender Man, Jeff the Killer, and Momo do now. He was an urban legend and a meme, but anyone entirely willing to write off Spring-Heeled Jack as some moral panic misses the point a little. There was a very real basis for much of his tale. So who was Spring-Heeled Jack? Descriptions of Spring-Heeled Jack vary, but most contain the same basic elements. He was tall and slender. Often first impressions of him are of an ordinary English gentleman, till the witness or the victim got closer. Usually then they would notice his intense red eyes that, to quote, resembled red balls of fire, end quote. He had what in those days was described as, quote, a terrifying diabolical physiognomy, or in other words, he looked physically frightening, and what one would imagine the devil to look like if he were to take human form. Most victims described either claws in place of human hands, or hands with sharp metallic points attached to his fingertips. Though he spoke English, he also appeared to speak in tongues and had a piercing, diabolical laugh. Occasionally wearing a helmet and tight-fitting garment which resembled an oilskin, something which must have been added later as the oilskin was not even invented till the end of the 19th century. This supervillain could jump buildings in a single bound, and on occasions could breathe blue and white flames. So where did this all start? In October 1837, Londoner Mary Stevens was walking to work, a house in Lavender Hill in south of the city, where she earned a crust as a servant. Making her way through Clapham Common in the early morning, a demonic-looking figure jumped out at her, seizing her in a tight grip and kissing her face frenetically, with claws described by Stevens as, quote, cold and clammy as those of a corpse. He began to tear at her clothes. Mary Stevens screamed at the top of her lungs, bringing many locals out onto the common. Startled, the figure took off at an allegedly superhuman speed. A day later, this attacker was seen again, this time near Mary's home in Battersea. This time reports tell of a demonic-looking figure leaping, as if from nowhere, directly into the path of a horse-drawn carriage. The coachman swerved, crashing and badly injuring himself. Again locals came out to investigate, catching view of Spring-Heeled Jack. Several gave chase, but all the while cackling in a high-pitched voice, Jack tore off at a great speed towards a 9-foot-high brick wall. In a single bound he cleared the wall, leaving his pursuers perturbed and horribly out of breath. Public reports of this new revenant went quiet for a little time after this. Ghost sightings had not been that uncommon in London leading up to this. From the first sightings of the Hammersmith ghost in 1803, they had become a little viral. But usually it was something only seen by a solitary person. Jack had been eyeballed by dozens of people on 2 occasions now. This all changed at a public meeting held by Lord Mayor of London, Sir John Cohen, on the 9th of January 1838. On the agenda that day, one piece of news which would soon grip the imagination of London and the wider United Kingdom. Lord Mayor Cohen reported to onlookers that he'd received a complaint, in writing, from a source he only referred to as a resident of Peckham. An excerpt from the report shared among all in attendance follows, to quote, it appears that some individuals, brackets, of, as the writer believes, the highest ranks of life, end brackets, have laid a wager with a mischievous and foolhardy companion that he durst not take upon himself the task of visiting many of the villages near London in 3 different disguises, a ghost, a bear, and a devil, and moreover that he will not enter a gentleman's gardens for the purpose of alarming the inmates of the house. The wager has, however, been accepted, and the unmanly villain has succeeded in depriving 7 ladies of his senses, 2 of whom are not likely to recover, but to become burdens to their families. It goes on. At one house a man rang the bell, and on the servant coming to the open door, this worse than brute stood in no less dreadful figure than a spectre clad most perfectly. The consequence was that the poor girl immediately swooned, and has never from this moment been in her senses. The affair has now been going on for some time, and, strange to say, the papers are still silent on the subject. The writer has reason to believe that they have the whole story at their finger ends, but, through interested motives, are induced to remain silent." End quote. Lord Mayor Cowan stated his doubts to the veracity of this claim. However, onlookers stood up and proclaimed to have heard similar stories from their terrified servants. Similar tales to Mary Stevens's were shared from Kensington, Hammersmith and Ealing, taking place at different times between October 1837 and January 1838. Later that day, a reporter from the Times ran the story. This was subsequently picked up by newspapers across the United Kingdom on January 10, 1838. It's at this point that dozens of letters flooded in to Lord Mayor Cowan's office relating to frightened women, all claiming to have been stalked, spied upon or attacked by a shadowy, demonic figure. Several had deep wounds from his nails or claws. A few claimed the victim had gone into a fit after. One report even claimed Spring-Heel Jack had scared a victim to death. Cowan remained sceptical until a trusted friend visited him to report a servant in his employ had been attacked by a shadowy clawed figure, who wore a bearskin. It was at this point that Lord Mayor Sir John Cowan ordered police across the city to make it priority number 1 to locate this individual responsible and bring him in immediately. Okay folks, time for a quick message. We'll be back soon. Okay, so let's just jump right back into it. So far we have this tall, diabolical-looking man terrorising London for several months in 1837 and 1838, which all comes to a head after Lord Mayor Cowan's public meeting. Capable of athleticism way beyond the norm, this clawed, fiery-eyed, demonic presence has attacked at least a score of young women at night, scaring some into fits and scarring several victims deeply with his claw-like hands. On a number of occasions, locals have given pursuit, but Spring-Heel Jack has easily escaped, often leaping walls close to 3 metres high. Lord Mayor of London, Sir John Cowan, has given the order to the Metropolitan Police to capture Spring-Heel Jack at all costs, despite initially believing he was nothing more than a myth. So where now? His 2 most famous attacks, the Allsops and Scales assaults. On the 20th of February 1838, a stranger rang the bell at the gate of the Allsop residence, in the East London village of Old Ford. 18-year-old Jane Allsop got up cautiously to see who had stopped by at this hour. For you see, while not terribly late at 9:15, it was, to borrow Lord Lytton's phrase, a dark and stormy night. Old Ford was an isolated village. It was not the kind of night you'd want to be going out in. The Allsops were not used to visitors so late at night, even in the best of weather. Staring out the door, Jane could vaguely make out a tall, imposing, cloaked figure. "What is the matter?" she inquired.
"I am a policeman. For God's sake, bring me a light, for we have caught Spring-Heel Jack here in the lane,"
he said. Knowing of the tale and subsequent order from the Lord Mayor, she bolted back inside to fetch a candle for the officer. Back in a matter of seconds, she handed a lit candle to the figure. The stranger dropped his cape and held the candle under his face as a camp counsellor might a flashlight when preparing to tell a story of the hook-handed man. Jane Allsop stared in horror at the visage that greeted her. Tall, hideously ugly, demonic, with glowing red eyes. He wore a helmet, a tight-fitting, shiny suit, and had what appeared to be a lamp attached to his chest. As she screamed and recoiled in horror, Spring-Heel Jack leapt forward, exhaling a blue and white flame at Jane. Grabbing her by the neck and forcing her head under his armpit, the assailant tore at Jane's face and clothes with his claw-tipped hands. Mustering all of her strength, Jane managed to break free of Spring-Heel Jack and ran towards the door, but Jack grabbed her by the hair, pulling out tufts as he continued with his assault. First, Jane's younger sister Mary leapt up to protect Jane, but froze at the sight of Jack. Then her older sister, Sarah Hanson, managed to shove Jack back away off Jane and pull Jane to safety, slamming the door after themselves. Spring-Heel Jack banged on the door with great force, as the whole family screamed at the top of their lungs for someone to please go and get the police. Suddenly, silently, Spring-Heel Jack disappeared into the dark, stormy night from whence he came. 8 days later, he was to terrify another 18-year-old young lady, one Lucy Scales, on her way home from her brother's house. Seconds after she had stepped out onto the street, a scream was heard which woke the whole neighbourhood. Locals rushed out to find Lucy sprawled out in the middle of the road. Upon stepping out onto the street, Spring Heel Jack had approached her. She had screamed and fainted. Jack ran off before he could do any physical damage to Lucy. Between these two incidents, there was another attempted attack. On this occasion, at an address on Turner Street, a man could be heard knocking on the door and asking for the occupant by name, a Mr. Ashworth. Jack was a little too trigger-happy this night. As the servant boy came to the door to inquire who was knocking, he threw off his cloak, exposing his demonic visage. "The boy!" screamed. Spring Heel Jack ran. The boy noticed something no other victim had. On his cloak, a letter W was embroidered. The London Constabulary may have been out in force looking for Spring Heel Jack at this point, but it is now that the diabolical Jack disappears from London, more or less for 3 whole decades. This did not mean he had disappeared entirely, however. He is seen all over the south of Britain. Historian and guru of all things Forteana, Mike Dash, states that he was seen from Warwickshire in the north to Devon in the south, Yarmouth in the east to Herefordshire in the west, hundreds of kilometres either way from where he had started. These attacks bore all the usual hallmarks: surprise an unsuspecting traveller at night, claw and tear of him, flee in a manner perhaps familiar to a modern viewer of parkour videos today, but in a superhuman manner at the time, leaping hedges, walls, even over moving carriages. The same tall, diabolical figure, the helmet, the piercing red eyes. He briefly reappeared for a short spell of terror in 1872, then again in 1877. In the latter he picked perhaps the worst property in all of London to be terrorising. In Aldershot, Surrey, there was an army barracks. Well, there still is. The home of the British Army since 1854, after all. It is heavily guarded around the clock by men with guns. In 1877, the barracks held perhaps as many as 10,000 soldiers at any one time. In the spring of 1877, a tall, diabolical-looking man who could leap buildings in a single bound began to sneak up on lone sentries in the dead of night, grabbing their faces while perched atop sentry boxes. Some of the guards broke down in a mad panic. A few managed to regain their senses and fire off a volley or two in his direction as he bounded away. He returned in the autumn of 1877 to pull the same prank on a number of occasions. Later in 1877 he drew gunfire again, this time from locals, while leaping from rooftop to rooftop in the town of Newport. Locals claimed to have hit him, but Spring Heel Jack just shrugged it off and kept moving. He then disappears until, in one final reign of terror, he appeared way north, in Liverpool, in 1904. After several nighttime attacks, there had been one final time where he was seen in daylight bounding through the streets. Legend has it he came to a building, leapt the 25 feet to its roof, then bounded away, never to be seen again. So what are we to make of all this? Personally, I don't believe he was the devil incarnate, a ghost, an alien, or a monster. Given the long time frame, 1837 to 1904, I think it's fair to say there are multiple causes for the legend of Spring Heel Jack. I believe there were certainly 2 real attackers, and there may have been copycats, as one of the 2 certain attackers himself certainly was, and that much of the legend of Spring Heel Jack can be put down to mass hysteria as the legend spread. As time passed, Spring Heel Jack became more a meme in the manner evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins means, an idea which has spread amongst the people of Great Britain like a virus, first by word of mouth, then papers, then onto the penny dreadfuls. Memes mutate in ways out of the control of the storytellers, as stronger elements reproduce and weaker elements die off. In 1837, Spring Heel Jack was an athletic troublemaker. By the time of 1877, at Aldershot Barracks, he had become bulletproof. By 1904, Spring Heel Jack had become a bona fide superhero that could leap 25 feet into the air in a single bound. Along the way, Spring Heel Jack had become a boogeyman, a scary tale that you tell adolescents to scare them into being home by curfew. As a meme, he also, in turns, like Kamer's pest, hid for long periods of time dormant in cellars, trunks, and bookshelves, only to come forth, yet again. This is perhaps most stark in his re-emergence in Czechoslovakia in the years 1939 to 1945. During World War II, a folktale of a Perek, the Spring Man of Prague, appeared, a tall diabolical folk hero who could jump buildings in a single bound, who harassed the occupying Nazis in the city. Bringing the legend back to our time, however, what is certain is that several women were assaulted from 1837 to 1838. They have the scars to prove it, and sporadically till 1842. For these attacks there were two suspects. First, starting with the Alsop attacks, let's take care of the Great Pretender. Returning to the home invasion of the Alsop family on 20th February 1838, we do have a viable suspect, a man who was brought in but who was let go because he could not have carried out the other attacks, and he most certainly could not have breathed a blue flame. He was spotted leaving the crime scene by someone who had recognized him, and was caught in possession of the candle which Jane Alsop had brought to him. The man in question was a carpenter called Thomas Milbank. Because he couldn't breathe flames, he could not have been at the other attacks. He had alibis, and because he was blackout drunk on the night of the attack, when the Alsop family had claimed that their attacker was stone cold sober, and yes, I know that is a misunderstanding of what a blackout drunk can look like, he walked. I buy into expert opinion that on this attack only, Thomas Milbank was Spring-Heel Jack. The other attacks have a possible perpetrator, a young nobleman known in high society as the Mad Marquis, Henry de la Poer Beresford, the 3rd Marquis of Waterford. Let me share a little of his story and why he might have been our guy. On 6th of April 1837, the young Marquis, having recently been expelled from Oxford University for bad behaviour, arrives at Melton Mowbray's Thorpe End tollgate, heavily intoxicated and with an entourage in tow. When asked to pay the toll, a belligerent Marquis gets into an argument with the tollkeeper. Not that he couldn't afford to pay the toll, just that he preferred not to. The bridge, having recently been painted, was surrounded by paintbrushes and pots of red paint nearby. It wasn't long before Waterford and his entourage had the tollkeeper beaten, pinned to the ground, and painted red. A constable stepped in, only to be beaten, pinned, and painted also. From there, the drunken entourage rioted through the town, painting on doors and walls, destroying flower pots and business signs as they went. They vandalized the post office and tried to turn a caravan upside down. Several other policemen tried to stop them, being beaten and painted also for their trouble, till one officer managed to capture one of the group, one Edward Reynard, and throw him in a jail cell. The next day, a hungover Marquis showed up to rescue Reynard, paying many times the cost of the original toll to release him. The retinue were charged with several counts of common assault, paying £100, a significant sum of money, apiece. This is the incident that gave rise to the term "paint the town red," to describe a riotous night out on the town. Not long after this, the Marquis and his entourage found themselves caught up in an incident in Norway. Waterford harassed a local woman and got knocked out by a local with a morning star for his troubles. He soon returned to London just before the first Spring-Heel Jack attack happened. He remained in London till 1842, making the news regularly in his own name for various churlish incidents. In 1842 he married the socialite Louisa Stewart and moved to Curragmore House, Ireland. He managed to behave himself relatively, till his death in 1859, after having been thrown from a horse and breaking his neck. The Marquis of Waterford was an excellent athlete and an excellent horseman. His garments bore his family crest, a shield with a giant W on him, if you remember the failed Ashworth attack, where he cast off his cloak too soon. His entourage contained a skilled engineer who could have made spring-loaded shoes capable of giving him a boost when he leapt. High society suspected him of being Spring-Heel Jack, and that the slew of attacks were revenge for his perceived slights over Melton Mowbray and the Norwegian incident. Though hardly conclusive, Henry Beresford, 3rd Marquis of Waterford, is still considered the prime suspect in the early Spring-Heel Jack attacks. While admittedly Spring-Heel Jack was never as monstrous as a certain other Jack to stalk an area of London, half a century later, Jack the Ripper, killer of at least the canonical 5, and I've heard possibly as many of 11 victims, I still think he makes an interesting tale on how a panic can spread among a population. While writing the blog posts for this, I didn't post anything really on the societal context Spring Heel Jack grew out of. That's probably worth pointing out with rapid industrialisation and mass migration from the country to the city in the decades up to this time, with a wealth inequality between the haves and have-nots not really seen again until this decade in the Western world. And growing domestic unrest from resurgent trade unions, free again to protests from the mid-1820s. There were laws enacted during the Napoleonic Wars which made protests treasonous, but this is another story. And with the first wave of feminism only just around the corner, there was enough of an air of concern and uncertainty to allow a legend like Spring Heel Jack to take off. Most moral panics like Jack seem to gather steam during times of unrest. The more real elements of the tale. Well, the Marquis was a creep, a misogynist, and a bully who used his privilege to ruin several people's lives. If there was anything redeeming about him, I guess they'll have to look. Once he found his one true love, it appears at least he stopped being the guy was an asshole. Regarding Thomas Milbank, I'm really not sure what came of him. Neither did I mention that in the few areas later visited by later Jacks, like Peckham, they were convinced that he was a ghost or a devil, or that when copycat attackers showed up in Manchester, the writer Beatrix Potter commented on them as frauds, gangs of kids who had taken on the trope and who were up to no good. Likewise, I never mentioned Spring Heel Jack had a precursor, the masked Southampton ghost, who was alleged to have attacked a few people and fled in a similarly superhuman way. But I guess the time wasn't quite right for a ghoul to become a living meme in the times of the Southampton ghost. In any case, I did write this around the time of the Momo hysteria, as much as anything just to provide a little bit of a light on how these things can sometimes go. So I guess this is where I'll leave this one. So what was Spring Heel Jack? He was a vile sex attacker, an influence of wayward youth, a boogeyman, eventually an urban legend, and eventually a superhero. Ultimately, to many beyond the handful of victims, he became his age's embodiment of the unknown, always lurking in the dark and ready to attack. Alright, well thank you folks for tuning in. Please check back in with us in 2 weeks' time, and we will have another tale up. As always, please feel free to share the show around. Please go and like our Facebook page, facebook.com, Tales of History and Imagination. As I said previously, we do have some blog pages going up that are a little bit different to the usual scripts of these for the next couple of weeks, and those will be on historyandimagination.com. Please feel free to share this all around. As always, intro music, outro music provided by Ishtar, a New Zealand hard rock group who have no connection whatsoever to Spring Heel Jack. I'll be back in 2 weeks' time for more tales of history and imagination.
Sent out in the world, abandoned. Do with me what you may. Somehow I find myself upon an endless caravan of sights and sounds that shape our lives. Set from the stratosphere to travel till the end of time. One day, from so far